The castle had not hosted guests in decades. Its stones sweated with damp and its windows stared blankly across the moors, black panes glinting with lightning whenever the storm rolled through. Few dared to climb its winding road. Fewer still were invited. Frankenstein sat hunched over the great oak table in his study, a quill clamped awkwardly between his large fingers. Candlelight shivered on the walls, throwing tall shadows that seemed, at times, to lean closer and watch him write. "Dearest Count Dracula," he muttered aloud, scratching slowly across the paper, "it would give me no small pleasure to welcome you to a gathering of friends." The words looked pompous, he thought, but formality was expected. Monsters, like humans, judged one another mercilessly. Igor shuffled in, stooped and blinking, carrying an armful of wax seals. "Master, your handwriting resembles the footprints of a wounded crow." "It is dignified," Frank replied stiffly. "Besides, Halloween is our night. One must put effort into these things." Igor laid the seals down. "Effort, perhaps, but inviting Dracula, the werewolf, and the mummy? That is not effort, master. That is disaster." Frank ignored him. He dipped the quill again and continued, jaw tight with concentration. The letters sprawled unevenly, black ink pooling like bruises. "It has been too long," he said, half to Igor, half to himself. "The humans host their costume parties, their haunted houses, their candy feasts. And us? We sit in shadows, forgotten. No, not this year. This year, they will come here, to me. We shall have a party worthy of the night itself." Thunder rolled against the castle walls, as though offering its applause. Igor sighed, scratching behind one ear. "Shall I prepare the insurance papers before or after the chandelier falls?" Frank set down the quill and glared. "The chandelier will hold." "The chandelier," Igor said, groans louder than the werewolf after brandy. Frank waved him away. "Enough. Deliver these invitations before dusk tomorrow." The hunchback hesitated, then nodded. "As you wish, master. But when the night ends in broken glass and blood, I shall not mop it alone." Left with only the storm and the smell of hot wax, Frankenstein pressed his last seal into place. He gazed at the small stack of invitations, his chest swelling with grim satisfaction. For the first time in years, laughter would echo through these halls. Whether it would be joyous or bitter, that remained to be seen. The days before Halloween crept past like wary servants. The castle, normally silent but for the wind, became restless with clatter, groans, and the muttered curses of its master. Frankenstein lumbered through the great hall with a feather duster clutched like a weapon. He swiped ineffectually at cobwebs, which clung stubbornly to his hands until he gave up and muttered, "Authentic atmosphere." Igor trailed behind him with a bucket. Dust alone could feed the mummy for a week. "Perhaps he will be grateful." "Ungrateful is his nature," Frank said. He paused beneath the chandelier, eyeing it with suspicion. The great iron beast hung low, its chains sighing whenever the wind shifted. "Reinforce it," he said. "With what?" Igor asked. Frank thought. "Nails. Rope. The iron will suffice." Igor smirked. "And prayers?" Frank scowled but said nothing. In the kitchen, preparations fared no better. The oven belched smoke whenever Frank opened it. A tray of what he optimistically called finger foods had, indeed, produced fingers burnt black, stiff, and unsuitable for polite company. "Catering might have been wiser," Igor said, poking one charred digit with a fork. "Catering is for humans," Frank grumbled, scraping the tray into the fire. "We shall have a proper feast. Roast beast, marrow stew, blood-red wine." "You cannot cook stew." "I can read instructions." "You cannot read Latin." Frank slammed the cookbook shut. Music proved another torment. His collection consisted of Gregorian chants, solemn, endless, and fit for funerals, and a dusty box of polka records left by some forgotten villager. He tried both. The chants made the great hall sound like a morgue, the polka made it sound like an asylum. Igor covered his ears. "You will summon demons." "They are already invited," Frank muttered. By the night before Halloween, the castle looked almost festive in a grim, unsettling way. Candles lined the staircases, dripping wax like pale blood. Pumpkins sat in windows, their carved faces leering at the storm. The table was set, though its centerpiece, a bouquet of withered roses, looked more like a funeral offering than a welcome. Frank stood back, arms folded, studying his work. "It will do," he said. Igor made a sound halfway between a cough and a laugh. "Yes, if one's goal is to terrify rather than entertain, it will do admirably." Frank ignored him. In his chest, despite the cracked stitching and bolts, a flicker of anticipation stirred. Tomorrow, for one night only, his castle would no longer be silent. Tomorrow, the monsters would come. Halloween night broke with thunder, as if the heavens themselves disapproved. Rain lashed the turrets, wind clawed at the shutters, and deep within the castle, Frankenstein adjusted his bow tie with fingers far too large for the task. Too tight, Igor muttered, tugging at it. Too loose, Frank countered, pulling the other way. At last, the tie sat askew, wrinkled like a strangled bat. They left it there. Candles burned low in the great hall. Shadows stretched long across the table, over the plates and polished goblets, waiting. The chandelier above groaned ominously. The knock came at the stroke of 9. Frank opened the vast wooden doors to find Count Dracula standing immaculate in a cloak blacker than the storm. His hair gleamed, his shoes shone, and his expression carried the permanent sneer of someone inspecting a subpar hotel. "My dear Frankenstein," Dracula said, sweeping in without waiting. "Your hospitality is quaint." His eyes flicked up toward the ceiling. "Though your chandelier appears to be hanging on by a thread, it will hold," Frank said stiffly. Dracula's mouth curved in disbelief, but he said nothing. The second guest did not knock. The werewolf burst in, dripping wet, shaking water from his fur like a dog that had discovered upholstery. His waistcoat was stained, his breath smelled of brandy, and his laugh echoed loud enough to rattle the windows. "Frankie, old corpse," he roared, clapping Frank on the back so hard the stitches along his shoulder winced. "You've done it, a proper monster's revel. Where's the drink?" "On the table," Frank said, recovering his balance. The werewolf was already halfway there, snatching a bottle of wine and biting the cork free with his teeth. Dracula sniffed. "Barbaric, efficient," the werewolf replied, spraying drops across the carpet. The mummy arrived last, with all the urgency of a funeral procession. He shuffled into the hall trailing sand and dust, his bandages unraveling in a way that suggested he had been too proud or too tired to fix them. "It is cold," he complained immediately. His voice rasped like dry leaves. "Always cold in Europe, drafts in every corner. My joints are stiff. Would you like a chair by the fire?" Frank asked. "I would like to go back to my tomb," the mummy muttered, lowering himself into the nearest chair with a grunt of ancient bones. And so the hall filled with monsters. A witch arrived uninvited, her hat dripping rainwater. A pair of ghouls slunk in, whispering and sniffing at the appetizers. Even a pale ghost drifted through the door without knocking, bowing apologetically before settling into the rafters. Frank raised his glass, heart swelling. The table was crowded, the hall alive with voices. At last, he thought, he had done it. "Friends," he began, "welcome to my..." The werewolf howled mid-toast, Dracula rolled his eyes, and the mummy sneezed dust across the table. Frank lowered his glass. The night, he realized, was only beginning. The great hall had not known such noise in centuries. The walls shook with laughter, growls, and the occasional thud of overturned furniture. For the first time, the castle did not feel like a mausoleum. It felt alive, though not in a way the local villagers would have appreciated. Dracula occupied the head of the table despite not being the host, speaking at length about his ancestral castle in Transylvania. "It is taller," he said, "and older, and far less drafty." He swirled his goblet of blood-red wine, sniffing disdainfully. "Imported Romanian vintage, not whatever this is." "It's Merlot," Frank muttered, but no one heard him. The werewolf had abandoned the table altogether. He had commandeered a section of floor as a makeshift dance hall, spinning wildly to the gramophone's polka record. His claws scraped gouges into the boards, his tail swept cups from side tables, and he occasionally howled mid-spin, which rattled the chandeliers enough to send flakes of plaster snowing down. The mummy did not dance. He sat stiffly near the fire, glowering at everyone. "Too loud," he said. "Too damp, too much polka." His bandages sagged dangerously near the flames, and Igor hovered nearby with a bucket, just in case. The witch had installed herself at the buffet. Every few minutes, she tapped the food with her wand. The bread moaned, the cheese grew teeth, and the punch occasionally burped. Guests avoided the table after that. The ghouls found themselves delighted by the burnt finger foods. They gnawed happily on the blackened digits, crunching bones like breadsticks. "Exquisite," one of them exclaimed. "Smoky," with a hint of despair. Frank tried to circulate, to be a good host, but his height and bulk made mingling difficult. Whenever he leaned down to speak, candles trembled in their holders. Whenever he turned, his elbow knocked goblets from the table. The ghost drifted above, quiet and polite, occasionally apologizing for existing. At last, Frank tried again to raise his voice over the chaos. "My friends," he called, "I welcome you to my home, where tonight The chandelier gave a long, wrenching creak. Every head tilted upward. Igor muttered, "I told you." The chain snapped. The chandelier plunged, candles scattering, iron screaming as it fell. Guests dove for cover. The mummy groaned and didn't bother moving. With a shattering crash, the chandelier struck the table, crushing goblets and splintering plates. Flames licked at the tablecloth. For a long moment, silence reigned, broken only by the drip of spilled wine and wax. Then the werewolf threw back his head and laughed. "Best party trick I've seen in years." Dracula dabbed dust from his cloak, expression icy. "Primitive." The mummy coughed soot. "Predictable." Igor handed Frankenstein a bucket. "Shall I begin mopping now, master?" Frank stood frozen, smoke rising around him, party in shambles. This was not how he had imagined it. And yet, the monsters laughed, drank, and resumed their bickering. The party lived on, even in wreckage. Perhaps especially in wreckage. For monsters, chaos was tradition. The chandelier lay in ruins, smoldering like a fallen star in the center of the hall. Yet the monsters simply adapted. The werewolf used a bent candelabra as a drinking horn. The witch set the tablecloth aflame on purpose, then extinguished it with a flick, for drama. The ghouls clambered onto the wreckage, declaring it ambiance seating. Frankenstein, however, could not shake the sense that his evening teetered on a knife's edge. That edge came sharpest in conversation. Dracula, glass in hand, had taken it upon himself to lecture the room. "True horror," he said, "is elegance. Precision. A single bite, a single scream in the night. Not," he gestured vaguely toward the werewolf, who was gnawing through his second chair leg. "Not this rural spectacle." The werewolf bared his teeth, wine dripping from his whiskers. Says the bat who hides in a castle, whispering bedtime stories. "You're not horror, Vlad, you're wallpaper." Dracula's eyes narrowed to red slits. "I am legend, you are mange." The werewolf leapt onto the wreckage of the chandelier, sending sparks and laughter in equal measure. "Legend? You? Please. Half the village thinks you're just a man with anemia and a cape." The hall erupted. The ghouls cackled, the witch howled. Even the ghost emitted a sympathetic little whistle. Dracula smiled thinly, showing teeth sharp as daggers. "Mock me again, dog, and you will discover how legends are made." Meanwhile, the mummy had cornered Igor near the fire. "In Egypt," he droned, "we built monuments that pierced the heavens. Structures to outlast the sun itself. And here I sit," he rattled the iron poker for emphasis, "in a damp hall, with drafty windows, listening to drunk dogs howl." Igor nodded, eyes glazed, regretting every career choice that had led him here. "Do you know what linen costs these days?" the mummy continued, tugging at his unraveling bandages. "And no respect, none. At least when I was entombed, people feared me. Now I am confused with toilet paper." Across the hall, the witch had taken offense at the ghost's polite hovering. "You call that haunting?" she snapped, pointing her wand at him. "You're softer than a breeze. I could conjure more terror with my laundry list." The ghost sighed. "I apologize. I never wanted to haunt anyone. I died of indigestion. This is all administrative error." The witch cackled. "Indigestion? My dear phantom, even your death is dull." Frank tried, once more, to interject. "My friends, perhaps we could." But his voice drowned beneath the werewolf's howl, the mummy's rant, the witch's shrieking laughter. The hall roared with overlapping quarrels, chaos building like a storm. Igor shuffled up beside him, muttering, "And you feared the food would ruin things." Frank rubbed his temples. It was meant to be a gathering, a celebration. Instead, it was a battlefield. The castle could take many things. Storms that clawed at its towers, villagers with torches, even centuries of silence. What it could not endure was a ballroom full of monsters with fragile egos and too much wine. The quarrels, once scattered, began to merge into one great, unholy chorus. The werewolf had climbed onto the wreck of the table, now using a platter as a drum. His claws beat a manic rhythm, and with each thud, fragments of crockery flew into the air. Dracula, unimpressed, rose to his full height and slammed his goblet down. "This is barbarism," he hissed. "There is no grace, no form, no dignity. A true gathering is candlelight, velvet, and poetry. Not this kennel masquerading as festivity." "Grace?" The werewolf barked a laugh. "You sleep in dirt, Vlad. Ancestral soil, dirt." The werewolf punctuated his point by hurling the platter at Dracula's head. The vampire caught it neatly, then snapped it in half as though breaking a cracker. He smiled, showing fangs bright as knives. The ghouls applauded. At the fireplace, the mummy decided he had endured enough. He rose creakily, his bandages dragging ash behind him. In my day, he thundered, we cursed our enemies for eternity. We didn't sit around drinking punch like simpering villagers. We carved dread into stone. No one asked you, muttered the witch, who had been attempting to charm the punch into breathing fire. The mummy whirled. Witch, you boil herbs and call it power. I commanded legions. Legions wrapped in linen, she snapped. If I sneezed, you'd unravel. The mummy bellowed, rattling the windows. Meanwhile, the ghost attempted once again to make peace. Perhaps, he said gently, we could all take a deep breath. I don't breathe, Dracula snapped. Neither do I, added the mummy. The werewolf burped. The witch lit the curtains on fire. Frank had watched in silence, hands twitching at his sides, bolts humming faintly with irritation. This was not the Gothic soiree he had planned. This was a circus, and his name was on the posters. At last, he roared. The sound shook dust from the rafters and sent even the ghouls skittering back. Enough. The hall froze. Even the fire seemed to hesitate. Frank stood, towering, eyes glowing faintly in the candlelight. This is my house, my gathering, and if you cannot behave like guests, then you are not welcome. For a moment, the monsters stared at him, stunned into silence. Then, from the wreckage, the werewolf let out a low chuckle. Well, the corpse speaks. The spell broke. Chaos rushed back in like floodwater. The mummy bellowed, Dracula hissed, the witch's fire climbed the wall, and Igor appeared at Frank's elbow with a bucket and a sigh. The breaking point had come. And the night was not over yet. The hall became a battlefield disguised as a party. The witch's flames leapt from curtain to curtain until the air swirled with smoke. The mummy, enraged, tore down what he could to smother the fire, but in doing so unraveled another yard of his ancient wrappings. Ghouls wrestled over bones beneath the table. Dracula vaulted onto the wreckage of the chandelier, cape flaring like a storm cloud, declaring himself master of the night. The werewolf hurled back, you're master of nothing but your own reflection, and leapt after him. The two collided mid-air in a blur of claws and fangs. The chandelier snapped further beneath them, showering sparks that the witch gleefully directed toward the tapestries. The ghost, pale and wobbling, tried once again to mediate. If we could only. He was bowled over by a runaway ghoul who had decided to surf across the floor on a serving tray. At the buffet, Igor attempted triage. He swept smoldering platters off the table, stomped on glowing embers, and swatted at the witch's enchanted fire with the already ruined tablecloth. His muttering grew louder with each failure. Should have gone to trade school. Should have gone to trade school. In the middle of it all stood Frankenstein. His shoulders squared, bolts sparking, eyes blazing with equal parts fury and despair. This had been his night. His grand attempt at community, his rebellion against loneliness, his offering to the world of monsters who, he thought, might understand him. Now it was collapsing into smoke and screams. Stop this, he roared. His voice shook the chandeliers that hadn't already fallen, but it was swallowed by laughter, brawls, and the crash of another chair reduced to splinters. He seized Dracula by the collar, yanking him from mid-lunge. You will sit, Dracula hissed, cape twitching like wings, but for once he did not resist. There was something in Frank's voice. Raw, desperate, that even the vampire recognized. But the werewolf was not so easily cowed. He snarled, leapt onto the table, and began howling at the storm outside as if calling reinforcements. His howl cracked glass in the windows. And the storm answered. Thunder shook the castle, lightning split the sky, and one of the great stained glass windows shattered inward, spraying shards across the floor. Wind howled through the hall, carrying rain and the distant toll of the village bell. The party had become a riot. Frank stared at the wreckage, his ruined table, his burning draperies, his friends, tearing one another apart, and for the first time that evening, he wondered whether the castle itself might prefer silence. The night was unraveling faster than his stitches. The storm outside beat against the castle walls, a merciless percussion to the mayhem within. Rain streamed through the shattered window, turning the ballroom floor slick and treacherous. Candle flames guttered in the gale, casting long, twitching shadows across the carnage. The chandelier wreckage smoldered like the skeleton of a fire. Ghouls scrambled through it with the tenacity of rats, and somewhere in the corner Igor was still valiantly trying to beat the witch's enchanted flames into submission with a soup ladle. Frank's chest rose and fell like a bellows. His bolts sparked, each flicker of light an echo of the storm outside. He had dreamed of laughter, of warmth, of monsters finding kinship, if not joy, in one another's company. He had imagined glasses raised, stories shared, perhaps even a toast in his honor. Instead, he was presiding over chaos. Dracula snarling from a shattered table leg, the werewolf pacing in circles, the mummy sulking in tatters, the witch shrieking as she rode a broom in dangerous circles under the sagging rafters. And the ghost, the poor ghost, had retreated into a corner, murmuring apologies to the wind. This was not a gathering. This was a failure carved into his very name. Frank slammed his fists onto the table, or what remained of it. Plates rattled, one last wineglass toppled, and silence briefly staggered through the hall. "Look at yourselves," he thundered. His voice cracked like the lightning outside. This was to be a night of fellowship, a night of, his voice wavered, of belonging, and you've turned it into mockery, into madness. The monsters shifted uneasily. Even the werewolf's snarl faltered. "You mock my food, you break my hall, you scorn one another like children in a schoolyard. Is this what we are? Is this what we will always be? Monsters too broken to share a single table?" His words struck harder than his fists. For a heartbeat, silence truly did settle, an awful, hollow quiet, filled only by the crackle of wet flames and the hiss of the storm. Then Frank's massive shoulders sagged. His voice dropped. "I only wanted to not be alone." Those words carried more weight than thunder. The ghouls stilled. The witch faltered mid-flight and slowly descended, broomstick squeaking on the wet floor. Even Dracula, still perched like a wounded raven, lowered his eyes. The storm pressed against the windows, but within the hall, the greater storm had broken. For the first time that night, the monsters seemed to see Frankenstein not as a towering creation of stitched flesh and lightning, but as a host, a man, in his way, who had opened his home only to watch it be torn apart. Frank sank heavily into his chair, which groaned beneath his bulk. His great hands hung limp at his sides, and his gaze lingered on the flames licking the ruined draperies. The party had reached its lowest point, and so had he. For a long moment, none of them moved. The storm outside raged, but within the castle, silence had grown heavy, heavier than the smoke, heavier than the smell of scorched velvet. It pressed on every creature's chest, even those who technically had no lungs. Dracula was the first to break it. He stepped down from the wreckage of the table, his boots splashing in the puddles of rainwater. He adjusted his cape, but the usual arrogance had fled his face. He looked smaller, somehow. "You are right," he said at last, his voice low, grave. "We have behaved disgracefully. You welcomed us, and we." He glanced toward the shattered chandelier, the ripped tapestries, the smoldering curtains. "We gave you ruin." The werewolf shifted uncomfortably, scratching behind one ear. I just got carried away." "You always get carried away," muttered the mummy, but the bite had gone out of his voice. The witch lowered her broom to the floor with a sheepish creak. "I may have overcooked the decorations." A ghoul belched, another elbowed it into silence. In his chair, Frank lifted his head. His eyes were rimmed with something close to grief, but he said nothing. The ghost, trembling, floated forward. "We've all been unkind, but you opened your home. You gave us food and fire and a place where, perhaps, we didn't have to hide. We treated it like a joke." His translucent voice quavered. "Forgive us." Frank's gaze moved over them. The mummy, unwinding by the hearth. Dracula, water dripping from his pale hair. The werewolf, tail tucked in sheepishness. The witch, fidgeting with her charred hat. The ghouls, shifting guiltily like children caught stealing sweets. Something inside his massive chest softened, just slightly. "You broke my house," he rumbled. "Yes," Dracula admitted, "utterly. You mocked my food." The werewolf raised a paw. "To be fair, it was." The mummy elbowed him sharply. "Delicious." It was delicious. Frank's lips twitched, though it could not quite become a smile. And yet, his voice trailed. He looked at the ruins of the feast, the torn velvet, the storm dripping in through the windows. "And yet you are still here. None of you have fled." The ghost tilted his head. "Where would we go? Back to crypts and caves and coffins? Back to solitude?" Dracula gave a slow nod. "For all our bluster, we came here because we wanted this. Even if we did not know how to show it." The witch sighed, sparks fluttering from her fingertips. "Monsters don't gather well, but maybe we can learn." The mummy, voice like dry stone, muttered, "I'll even fix the drapes." Somehow, a sound rose then, unexpected. Igor, still wielding his soot-stained ladle, began to clap. It was slow, uneven, but it filled the hall. "About time," he grumbled. "I patch this place together every week. Nice to see you lot patching yourselves." The ghouls joined in, awkwardly smacking their bony hands together. The witch chuckled. Even Dracula allowed himself a faint smile, sharp and tired. For the first time since the night began, the hall did not feel like it was about to collapse. For the first time, it felt barely, tentatively, like a party. The ruins of the chandelier were shoved into a corner. The drapes were left to smolder until the witch muttered a charm that turned the flames into faintly glowing moths, which fluttered away into the rafters. Igor collected what plates had survived and stacked them proudly, as though this salvage were evidence of his genius. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "All right," Frank rumbled, pushing himself up from his chair. His voice no longer carried the thunder of despair but the iron weight of determination. "We will not end like this. If it is broken, we will mend. If it is ruined, we will build again. We are monsters. We endure." The ghouls cheered, though one managed to tip over a chair in the process. "First things first," said Dracula, clasping his hands. "Food. A host should not have to serve alone." The werewolf's ears perked. "I can cook. Well, I can eat, but I can cook if someone watches me." The mummy shuffled toward the kitchen, grumbling. "I'll supervise. Don't touch the spices without me." Meanwhile, the witch flicked her fingers and coaxed broken glass back into rough goblets. They were jagged and faintly glowing, but they would hold liquid. "No sense drinking out of skulls like peasants," she muttered. The ghost, hesitant but determined, drifted to the piano in the corner. Its keys were warped and yellow with age, but when he laid his spectral fingers upon them, a thin, eerie melody rose into the hall. The notes wavered, but there was beauty in them, like wind moving through a graveyard at dusk. And just like that, the castle began to change. The kitchen filled with the smell of something almost edible. The werewolf had managed a stew, though it contained at least one unidentified paw, which the mummy discreetly removed. Dracula emerged carrying bottles of deep red wine, which he swore, on his honor, was at least mostly from grapes. The witch scattered sparks through the air until they hung like stars, turning the damp ballroom into a cosmos of light. The ghouls set about stacking broken chairs into a strange, lopsided pyramid, declaring it modern seating. Frank stood at the center of it all, watching, his heavy chest swelling with something dangerously close to pride. The night had been a disaster, yes, but now there was music, and warmth, and voices raised in something more than anger. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't even tidy, but it was his. The ghost's music carried through the storm. The monsters gathered with bowls and goblets in hand, raising them in a rough circle. Dracula lifted his glass, solemn. "To our host." To Frank, the witch echoed, sparks trailing from her hand. The werewolf wagged his tail. "To parties." The mummy sighed, but raised his cup anyway. "To not burning down the house." Igor lifted his ladle, grinning through the soot. "To family." And Frankenstein's monster, stitched together from the cast-offs of men, given life by lightning and rejected by the world, lifted his glass last. His voice was quiet, but it filled the hall. "To belonging." The glasses clinked, uneven but true. And for the first time in memory, the castle rang not with thunder, nor with loneliness, but with laughter. The storm had passed by dawn. The castle, though wounded, stood stubborn against the gray horizon, its spires ragged against the paling sky. The great hall reeked of smoke, spilled wine, and wet fur, but there was also the faintest trace of stew and the warmth of a fire that had lasted the night. The monsters, one by one, drifted into uneasy sleep. The ghouls collapsed in a heap like discarded laundry. The werewolf curled beneath the table, snoring into a broken platter. The witch dozed upright, her broom propped under her chin. Even Dracula, pride sacrificed for exhaustion, rested in an armchair, his cape wrapped around him like a child with a blanket. Frank did not sleep. He sat in his chair, watching them. His guests, his friends? The chandelier lay in pieces. The velvet was ruined. The stone floor would take months to scrub clean. But for the first time since lightning gave him breath, he did not feel entirely alone. At length, Igor shuffled in, carrying 2 mugs of something dark and steaming. He handed one to Frank. "Still want a refund on the night?" Igor asked, grinning with his crooked teeth. Frank held the mug in his massive hands. Steam curled upward. He thought of the disasters, the fight, the fire, the ruin. He thought of the toasts, the music, the fragile laughter that had broken through the gloom. "No," Frank said at last. His voice was low, but sure. This was good. Igor nodded. "Monsters. Hard to live with, harder to live without." Frank allowed himself the faintest smile. When the others woke, there would be bickering. They would complain about sore necks, bad wine, stew that tasted faintly of shoe. They would swear never to come back, then inevitably find their way to his gates again next year. And perhaps, Frank thought, that was the nature of belonging. Not perfection, but persistence. Not harmony, but the decision to gather despite the cracks and chaos. As the dawn light crept over the ruined feast hall, Frank raised his mug one last time to the empty air. To next year, and the castle, as if it too had heard, seemed to sigh in agreement. If you enjoyed spending Halloween night with Frankenstein and friends, don't let the fun die here. Hit that like button before the chandelier does, subscribe for more Gothic tales, and ring the bell so you never miss when the monsters come out to play.